In the forest, everything grows slowly. But our world is much faster. The climate is warming and extreme weather events are more and more frequent. And humans need the forests to help overcome the challenges. But for forests to have a chance in the future requires our help as well. And this is why we need to understand how the entire forest ecosystem works. It's a huge task, but in a forest area outside Vindeln in Västerbotten, Sweden, there are some researchers who still want to try to understand every little part of what is happening among the trees.
We do have really big issues concerning carbon sequestration, biodiversity, and especially how are we going to manage our forest in the future climate, which will change temperature and precipitation patterns in ways that we cannot really foresee. And in order to find out, we need larger projects to think about these questions from a much broader perspective and not just think about them as individual questions, but thinking about it much broader.
In WIFORCE, Wallenberg Initiatives in Forest Research, the leading forest researchers from all over Sweden, along with 50 doctoral students, have come together to truly understand the forest from the ground up. And one of the mysteries they want to solve is this. About 10 years ago, something happened to the Swedish forest, right under the researchers' noses. After about 100 years of steadily increasing growth, the trend suddenly reversed. Growth slowed down and no one understood why. But it just might have to do with water, which is Hjalmar Lauden's specialty.
Water is critical. We know that that's what's going to be affected most when it comes to climate change. So we get more drought, but also more flooding. So we have both too little water and too much water. And those will be critical for understanding ecosystem health and tree functioning and what's going to happen with forest management in the future. We are in the Kryckland catchment, which is in Västerbotten in northern Sweden.
Kryckland is the researchers' unique test area. In the forests of Norrland, masts tower up, and on the ground under the treetops are countless measuring devices. Everything needed to follow the path of the water.
It's a field infrastructure to look at forest and forest growth and water quality, and carbon uptake and biodiversity. So we are looking at biogeochemistry, carbon sequestration, and climate change.
Utilizing customized technology, they can follow the water from the clouds all the way down into the ground. How the water then rises up through the trees and evaporates, or how it gets filtered through the ground and then flows into the waterways. It is a complex system, but a must to understand, for example, the cause of that sudden decline in forest growth. And Hjalmar has discovered that the years with the reduced growth coincided with the forest suffering from water shortages, which also came as a surprise to the scientists since the amount of precipitation had not changed. But the answer is to be found somewhere in the water cycle, and Hjalmar believes that the culprit might be the changing climate.
This is a winter experiment. We look at the influence of snow cover on soil processes, and especially on how the depth of soil frost. So how deep that goes in the winter, depending on how much snow we have. And it's been ongoing for over 20 years.
Here in northern Sweden, groundwater is primarily supplied through snowmelt. And if this occurs earlier in the year, there is less water left for the trees during the summer months when they need it most. Higher temperatures also increase evaporation. Rain that falls in the summer returns to the atmosphere instead of remaining in the ground. A likely explanation for why the forest began growing more poorly is a water shortage during the warmer months. But that may not be the whole explanation. Beneath the ground's surface is another world of life.
I think it's really important to understand what is going on underground. And one thing that is really great at the moment is that we have so many new methods that actually enable us to study things we haven't been able to study before. And this opens up a lot of knowledge to understand how we can manage the forest in the future sustainably.
Sandra Jemtgaard wants to understand how the tiny life forms underground affect the big ones above. And that's especially important now that the climate is changing. To grow, trees need sunlight and carbon dioxide from the air, but they also need nutrition from the soil. They get this in the form of nitrogen, but in order to access and utilize this, their roots need help from underground. Here are the bacteria and fungi that break down organic material, converting it into ammonium, nitrate, and amino acids, which can be absorbed by the tree's roots. And the roots are also helped by networks of fungal threads, so-called mycorrhiza. The small threads couple with the tree's roots and help them access the nutrients. And in return, the mycorrhiza receives sugar back from the tree. A win-win in a finely tuned system that Sandra now has to investigate to understand whether it is also being threatened by climate change.
We've had an increase in carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere, and this could potentially affect nitrogen availability.
When Sandra's not in the lab, she's out in places like Cricklin, where she can investigate the interaction of these tiny root threads with various microorganisms in the soil to understand what is actually best for the forest. The forestry industry, for example, adds artificial nitrogen fertilizer to make trees grow faster. But researchers have seen that these artificially fertilized trees do not need to develop the same intricate cooperation with the mycorrhiza and bacteria in the soil. As a result, the trees do grow bigger faster, but they have smaller root systems that can make them more sensitive to drought, to falling during storms, or attacks from pests.
The aim with the WIFORCE as a whole is to know how we should manage the forest in a sustainable way in the future when it comes to forest growth, carbon sequestration, and biodiversity under a changing climate. And in our research in my group, we are working on how carbon dioxide will affect nitrogen availability in the future. And part in that is the biodiversity and the species composition of bacteria and fungi, and also the function of these organisms.
All of the organisms of the forest help each other, but to cope with the future, trees may still need a little help from us humans too. Uwe Nilsson is researching the DNA of trees. He wants to help trees cope with all the challenges they are now facing, including the extreme weather that is expected.
So here we are now in the nursery, basically, where we bring up these new genetically modified trees. So what we do here is basic curiosity-driven research. So we really want to understand how the tree grows, how they take up nutrients, how they adapt to a changing climate.
At the Umeå Plant Science Center, Uwe and his colleagues are growing the next generation of trees. By modifying different genes in these small plants and then observing them as they grow, they learn exactly which genes control different characteristics. This research forms the basis for continued plant breeding to produce trees that can best cope in a changing climate with drought, disease, and fungal attacks. Traditionally, breeding methods have taken a very long time, taking about 30 to 40 years for each new generation of trees to grow. But utilizing new techniques, Uwe and his colleagues can now examine all of the genes in a tree at the same time. In a typical spruce, there are about 40,000. Then advanced statistical modeling is performed to find out exactly which combination of the 40,000 genes gives the right kind of characteristics to, for instance, cope with periods of drought. Then they can know that they are planting the right tree from the start, instead of having to wait 30 years to see the results.
So with the knowledge about the variation in the trees and how this is connected to different properties, we can really work much more efficiently in the breeding programs to generate the next generation of trees that are better adapted to future climates, to new diseases and so on.
Getting to this point in their research has required hard work over a long period of time for Uwe and his colleagues. Over the years, they have examined thousands of genes one by one to understand what gives different characteristics to trees. And because the climate is changing so rapidly, it is a race against time.
We need forest production for this green transition and to keep the oil and the coal in the ground. But we also need to take into account the effects on biodiversity to have a sustainable system. And we need to take into account effects on carbon storage and so on in the forest. So it becomes a very complex trade-off between these different aspects.
Modern society has placed high demands on forests. For the climate, they need to be a carbon sink, but they should also be a basis for replacing fossil-based products. Society wants to get biofuel from the forests while at the same time letting them grow, and all that while caring for biodiversity. And in this work, it is not only people who count. Maja Sundqvist and Hjalmar Stake are investigating the role of large grazing animals such as moose and reindeer in the forest. These animals are not always popular among forest owners. Moose, for example, eat the new seedlings that are planted after a felling. Maja and Hjalmar want to see the effect these animals have on biodiversity.
Herbivores play an enormous role for what ecosystems look like because they feed on plants. They also can shape what community composition we have of plants because of their selective feeding. If they can select, they would prefer certain plants over others, and that affects the dynamics of which are dominant and less dominant of plant species in a community.
71 skott.
71.
Och inga betade.
Nej, jag såg inte heller det. On top of that, they affect nutrient cycling by transferring nutrients around in the ecosystem and through urine and fecal deposits. But they also disturb the soil through trampling, which can affect chemical and physical processes in the soil. Finally, by shaping plant communities and the type of plants we have in an ecosystem, they also affect how much nutrients that are returned from the entire plant community at senescence, because different plants have different amounts of nutrients in them.
Maja and Hjalmar want to investigate the role of grazing animals in both forests that have been affected by humans and in those that are more or less untouched, all to understand how we can manage the forests in the future in a way that makes both animals and people as happy as possible.
This is a rowan and it is very heavily browsed. So as we can see on this one, almost every single shoot has been browsed.
Just like humans, moose and reindeer have their favorite foods. For example, deciduous trees such as rowan are highly sought after by moose. And by choosing to eat certain plants over others, the animals help determine which trees are allowed to grow large in the forest. So although moose do not directly increase timber production, they do spread plants and nutrients and thus diversity in the forest. And no one knows yet what significance it will have in the future.
The timescales at which these kind of relationships occur are really, really long. So we need to get that really long-term perspective included in the understanding of how to manage forest to promote biodiversity. It's important to understand because these large herbivores are a major part of the forest biodiversity. They are affected by the forest biodiversity and they shape forest biodiversity.
Moose, reindeer, tiny, thin threads of underground fungal networks, all species gene sets, and then the water that needs to flow through everything that lives in just the right way. The forest ecosystem is incredibly complex, and now, in times when the climate is changing and species are disappearing, it is vitally important to understand the entire forest as quickly as possible in order to be able to help it adapt.
We can think about how can we use the forest resource in the best way, both in terms of sequestering carbon, but also protecting biodiversity, because we still will require using our forest for energy, for construction work, for paper, and for other producers.
I'm very hopeful when it comes to the future of Swedish forests, especially when I see all researchers approaching this from many different angles. I think this really is the way forward. I think the chances of finding solutions for sustainable management of the forest is very high.